Moab, Utah is an outdoorsman's mecca. Thousands of miles of trails and endless great views. Anyone interested in an outdoor sport wants and needs to see this area of the US. The possibilities of things to do are endless, and this is exactly what 30-year-old River Barry was interested in on the weekend of November 26, 2022. Standing in the parking lot of Moab's Kane Creek Canyon Natural Preserve, River was prepping her gear for a mountain bike ride. Getting to the trailhead early in the morning, her and her two friends were excited for the day ahead. Doing some routine maintenance on her bike before heading out on the trail, she bent over to pump up her tires. Once her tires were at an appropriate pressure, she looked up to her friends. She instantly saw their faces turn to horror with what they saw behind her. As she turned around to see what she missed, the scene she saw in front of her was deadly. Seeing a man hanging by his parachute on a cliff face just off in the distance. She then asked her friends what exactly happened, and they explained, saying that the man was clearly base jumping from the top of the cliff and that something had gone wrong when he deployed his parachute, sending him directly into the rock face once opened. The man slid down the face until his chute got stuck on a cliff for all to see in the valley. River looked up at the cliff and knew the jumper was in trouble. While the identity of the jumper is being kept anonymous, what we do know is that during that weekend, the Turkey Boogie 2022 was in full swing, an annual local base jumping festival that brought in hundreds of base jumping enthusiasts to Moab. The jumper in question was an Australian man who was an experienced and veteran base jumper. Explained by local base jumper Jason Beatler, who was also there that day, as the jumper took the plunge off the cliff, it was just a few moments before he pulled his parachute. Expecting a scarlet bloom of fabric to unfold above him, this should have been a routine jump. However, just a half a second after pulling his chute, it was apparent he wasn't being sent out away from the cliff. Instead, his chute opened backwards, and when it finally caught air, it sent him directly towards the rock face. Parachute opening backwards isn't the most uncommon thing in the base jumping community, but when it opens completely backwards, the amount of time the jumper has to fix the issue is limited. While he did reach upwards to fix the direction the parachute was facing, he simply didn't have enough time. In this case, the jumper's chute opened about 160 degrees off heading of the way he wanted to go. The speculation is that maybe the body position of the jumper, or potentially the asymmetry of his packed pack, led to this error. Either way, it didn't matter. There was no time for him to fix the issue in the moment, and he was along for the rough ride into the cliff face. Explained by Beatler, who was a close friend of the jumper, his body was spinning and he didn't have enough time to reach up and turn his chute. Instead of lifting the victim away from the wall, the parachute sucked him into it, slamming his body against the rock and sending him ragdolling along the cliff face. As he collided with the rock, the jumper was lucky when his parachute got caught on the end of a sloping ledge. Pinned by nothing more than friction and his own body weight, the jumper was hanging 80 feet off the ground. Back in the parking lot, Barry glanced up at the wall where the scarlet chute was still hanging. Watching in terror, a stranger came running up to her group. The stranger turned out to be Justin Beatler, who had watched the whole thing unfold from the bottom of the cliff face and had ran to the parking lot to seek help. Leaving two other friends at the base of the wall to watch over the victim, he knew at any moment the jumper's chute could slip off the face and send him plummeting down to the valley floor. Beatler began shouting as soon as he was within earshot of the parking lot, yelling if anyone had climbing gear in their car. Barry raised her hand and exclaimed, "I do. I have a double rack, 2 harnesses, and a rope in my van." Beatler ran over to her. "Give me what you got," he responded. Barry handed him a pack of full cams and packed a separate bag with food, water, and first aid. She began following him as they scrambled up the loose approach to the cliff face. After a few minutes of running to the face, they arrived at the base and Barry began putting on her harness. Talking over the plan with Beatler, Barry quickly realized she was on her own in the rescue mission. Beatler's initial plan was to climb the crack just above them for about 10 feet before traversing over to another crack, which led directly to the victim. Barry blinked a handful of times trying to find the line before realizing it was impossible. "That's not going to work," she said, as the traverse was non-existent on the wall. She further explained that the only way to get to the victim was to climb the line directly beneath him, a wide crack that looked to be about 5'10" in difficulty. To explain some climbing terms real quick, let's look at how hard of a climb this is. 5'10" being a difficulty rating created by the rock climbing community to compare certain lines with each other, this route wasn't a walk in the park. Being a difficult intermediate grade, only a decently skilled climber would be able to reach the victim. Further discussing her skill level with Beatler, it was clear Barry had extensive experience with lead climbing. Beatler himself explained that he had only ever led 2 climbs of his own. Barry took a deep breath, realizing there was no one else there who was going to do this, and looked up at the wall. Knowing the victim was moments away from plummeting to the canyon floor, she knew she had to go for it. The rock above her was spattered with blood, the victim was limp and was unconscious. She wasn't even sure if he was alive at this point, but what she did know was that the longer she took to get moving, the higher the odds that a wind gust would kick up and upset the precarious balance his chute had on the outcrop of rocks. The route to the victim looked loose and sandy, but Barry was confident she could get there safely. Her previous wilderness first responder training then kicked in. She took one final deep breath, thinking to herself, "I can do this." Beginning the climb, she faced very difficult climbing. Having a very wide crack that she wasn't the most experienced in, she had to fight to continue the climb. Moving through the off-width section of a narrow chimney towards the thinner crack at the top, she made great progress in the first 30 minutes of the rescue. Throughout the first half of the climb, she wasn't even sure if the victim was alive, and it wasn't until she was about 40 feet off the deck that she saw him breathing. Still, it was far too soon for any sense of relief. Handholds were popping off left and right. It was so sandy and the gear was scary. It was hard to tell what was real rock and what was flake, Barry said. On top of that, the victim soon began to wake up, rocking against his tenuous lines, slow at first, but then more violently. When Barry finally got close enough to make eye contact with him, the victim quickly locked eyes with her and began to moan loudly. He started to move, thrashing to alleviate his discomfort. Barry could see the parachute begin to slip. She could hear the desperation and agony in his voice, creating a very unnerving feeling for her. Once at the victim, Barry built the 3-piece anchor, leaned over him and grabbed a hold of his chest harness. She clipped him into her anchor and at this point felt the first wave of relief. He was in so much pain and kept asking her to take the weight off his leg. His face was pretty bloodied and his leg was very messed up. The man ended up having a broken femur in 5 different places. She climbed a few feet higher and built a more secure anchor to lock the pair deep into the rock face. Barry knew she had to get above the man to set the second anchor about 10 feet apart from the first. After setting this anchor up, she clipped him into it and then pulled out the emergency knife from the victim's harness. Pulling the man towards her, she began cutting his parachute lines, putting his full weight onto the harness she just secured. Only 3 of the lines were actually weight-bearing, but she cut everything she could. Cutting some lines more than once, she wanted to be sure he was free from the caught parachute. As she cut the last line, she felt his weight transfer seamlessly from the chute to her harness. After that, she swung the man flawlessly so he didn't crash into the cliff, and Beetler was able to belay the pair to the canyon floor. As the pair was lowered, the victim did pass out as the bleeding was becoming exceedingly bad, but the rescue was complete. Thankfully, the harness the victim was wearing did act as a tourniquet, which helped lessen the bleeding he experienced. By this time, Grant County Search and Rescue had arrived and were able to package the victim into a litter and get him airlifted to the hospital. The victim recovered to a stable state and was able to leave the hospital a few days later. While this was one of 3 major base jumping accidents that happened in the Moab area that weekend, the rescue Barry and Beetler accomplished is something to be admired. Without their quick action, first responders would have had to rappel 300 feet from the top of the cliff to reach the victim, an operation that could have taken hours. Hours the victim didn't have to spare. Without their quick action, the victim would have certainly faced more grave injury, if not death. As for Barry, she was still getting a lot of attention after the rescue, including questions about what she hopes to name the 80-foot route she first ascended in the process of the rescue. She did state that she hopes to return to free climb the route sometime in the near future, to put up a legit effort and establish the line. The quick-acting River Barry certainly was able to save a life that day, and for that we are all grateful.